The library was quieter than usual that Thursday afternoon, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel amplified. The turning of a page, the scrape of a chair, the faint hum of the heating system. Eleanor was shelving newly returned books when she noticed Caleb lingering at the archive table, staring at a worn journal he had clearly read dozens of times already. He looked up, catching her eye, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he said softly, almost as if he were admitting a secret, "I've been thinking about my childhood a lot lately, about how I learned early not to trust anyone fully." Eleanor paused, sensing the weight behind the words. "It's hard," she said gently, "to carry those things alone." Caleb's gaze dropped to the journal again. "I've always feared being someone's second choice, that no matter what I do, I'm only ever enough until something better comes along. My mother left when I was 9. I thought it was my fault for years." His hands curled slightly around the edges of the journal, knuckles white. "It made me careful, too careful." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She wanted to reach for him, to offer comfort, not advice, not judgment, just presence. The desire to touch, to hold, to show him he was seen, surged inside her with a force that both thrilled and terrified her. "You weren't at fault," she said very quietly. "No one can blame a child for what adults do." Caleb looked up then, really looked at her. There was a flicker in his eyes, a mixture of longing, recognition, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone could understand. Eleanor realized that what she was feeling went far beyond empathy. The pull toward him, the desire to comfort him, was now laced with something more dangerous: desire. They worked in silence for a while, the intimacy of the moment unspoken but palpable. Every glance, every slight movement seemed charged. Eleanor felt the line she had drawn for herself trembling. She was still married, still bound by her choices, still aware of the consequences, but the thrill of feeling alive again was overpowering. When Caleb finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said softly, "for listening, for just being here." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "Always," she replied, aware that her voice carried more than just reassurance. It carried an invitation she could not yet allow herself to name. That night, lying beside Richard, Eleanor's mind replayed every detail: Caleb's voice, the tremor in his hands, the vulnerability he had shown her. Desire and guilt mingled, a tension she could no longer ignore. She realized that whatever was beginning between them had grown beyond idle attraction. It was now a force with its own momentum. She did not know where it would lead. Only she knew she was powerless to stop feeling it. The weeks that followed brought a subtle shift Eleanor could not deny. Their encounters at the library became more than routine. Each time Caleb arrived, she noticed how her chest tightened when he smiled, how the sound of his voice lingered long after he left. She began anticipating his presence, savoring the moments they shared, and dreading the ones when he was gone. One rainy afternoon, they were alone in the archive. Eleanor had been sorting through a stock of old letters when Caleb quietly joined her at the table. He didn't speak at first, simply watching as she worked, hands moving carefully across the worn papers. There was a gentleness in his attention, a patience that contrasted sharply with the distance she felt at home. "I like how you notice details," he said finally. "Most people just glance and move on. You pay attention." Eleanor felt a shiver of recognition. To be seen like that, truly observed, without judgment, was intoxicating. "I suppose I've had practice," she murmured, aware of the double meaning she could not voice aloud. They lingered over the letters together, occasionally exchanging quiet comments. Each shared glance, each brush of their hands over the same page carried a tension that neither could ignore. Eleanor's pulse quickened at the smallest contact. It was innocent enough on the surface, just two people examining old documents, but underneath, every touch felt electric. For Eleanor, the contrast with her life at home was unbearable. Richard was polite, routine, dependable, but emotionally absent. In Caleb's presence, she felt alive, desired, acknowledged in ways she hadn't realized she missed. And with that awareness came guilt. Every thought of Caleb made her stomach tighten with fear and excitement simultaneously. One evening, after closing the library, Caleb walked her to the door. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that reflected the dim streetlights. They paused, neither moving to leave, and Eleanor felt the tension in the space between them like a physical weight. "Thank you," Caleb said softly, "for today, for everything." Eleanor nodded, unable to trust her voice fully. "Of course." It was a moment that changed nothing outwardly, but inside, everything had shifted. Desire and restraint began to battle for control, and Eleanor realized that she could no longer pretend that the boundaries she had set were intact. They had begun to blur. That night, lying in bed beside Richard, she felt the familiar weight of her marriage pressing down, but now it was sharpened by the contrast of what she had experienced with Caleb. She was aware for the first time in years of the life she might have chosen and of the danger of wanting it too much. The quiet intimacy they shared had already altered her. It was no longer something she could easily ignore.
The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Richard had always been polite, emotionally distant and absorbed in his routines. But recently, Eleanor noticed small, questioning glances, the way he lingered near her in the kitchen, asking more often where she had been or who she had spoken to. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, just an awareness that hadn't been there before. It started on a Tuesday evening. Eleanor returned from the library slightly later than usual, her coat damp from the rain, her thoughts still with Caleb. Richard looked up from the dinner table, eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Long day?" he asked, voice casual, but Eleanor felt the subtle tension behind the words. "Yes," she said, keeping her tone even. "Lots of work." He didn't press further, but later that night she caught him sitting in the living room with the newspaper folded back, pretending to read while listening for sounds from her room. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, even though she had not crossed any physical boundary with Caleb yet. Meanwhile, Caleb's presence in her thoughts had grown undeniable. She replayed their conversations, the way he had shared fragments of his childhood trauma, the way he had looked at her with trust and expectation. That trust called to something inside her she had long suppressed, the desire to be needed, to matter deeply to someone who could see her fully. At the library, their interactions remained careful, almost innocent, but Eleanor felt the tension in every glance. Caleb was patient, restrained, and yet she could sense The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Richard had always been polite, emotionally distant and absorbed in his routines. But recently, Eleanor noticed small, questioning glances, the way he lingered near her in the kitchen, asking more often where she had been or who she had spoken to. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, just an awareness that hadn't been there before. It started on a Tuesday evening. Eleanor returned from the library slightly later than usual, her coat damp from the rain, her thoughts still with Caleb. Richard looked up from the dinner table, eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Long day?" he asked, voice casual, but Eleanor felt the subtle tension behind the words. "Yes," she said, keeping her tone even. "Lots of work." He didn't press further, But later that night, she caught him sitting in the living room with the newspaper folded back, pretending to read while listening for sounds from her room. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, even though she had not crossed any physical boundary with Caleb yet. Meanwhile, Caleb's presence in her thoughts had grown undeniable. She replayed their conversations, the way he had shared fragments of his childhood trauma, the way he had looked at her with trust and expectation. That trust called to something inside her she had long suppressed, the desire to be needed, to matter deeply to someone who could see her fully. At the library, their interactions remained careful, almost innocent, but Eleanor felt the tension in every glance. Caleb was patient, restrained, and yet she could sense the longing beneath his composed exterior. Every small smile, every pause, every subtle acknowledgement of her presence sent shivers through her that she could neither name nor control. The combination of Caleb's emotional closeness and Richard's growing suspicion made Eleanor feel caught in a web she could not escape. She understood that the longer she lingered in this liminal space between desire and guilt, between fidelity and temptation, the harder it would be to maintain control. That night, lying in bed beside Richard, she felt the weight of both lives pressing down on her. The life she had chosen with her husband, safe and predictable, and the life stirring with Caleb, dangerous and intoxicating. She knew the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that once desire and attention had been acknowledged, once she had allowed herself to feel, it could not be easily undone. The pull toward Caleb had become not just emotional, but urgent, and she knew the first real test of her restraint would be coming soon. The pull Eleanor felt toward Caleb was no longer something she could dismiss as curiosity or fleeting intrigue. Each day she found herself scanning the library's schedule, waiting for the quiet moments when they could be alone. She justified it to herself in small ways. "I'm only helping him with research," she said silently. "I'm only answering questions." Yet deep down she knew these were rationalizations. Every stolen glance, every prolonged conversation made her heart race in ways she hadn't felt in years. One Friday afternoon, the library was nearly empty. The sunlight filtering through the high windows cast long shadows across the floor. Eleanor lingered near the archive room, pretending to organize returned books, but really watching the door, listening for Caleb's footsteps. When he arrived, she felt the familiar jolt in her chest, that dangerous mixture of anticipation and guilt. "Hey," Caleb said softly, his coat damp from a sudden spring rain outside. "Do you have a moment?" Eleanor nodded, almost breathless. "Of course." They retreated to the archive, the quiet room suddenly feeling intimate in a way it never had before. As they worked, their conversation drifted from letters and journals to personal reflections. Eleanor shared small details about herself, things she hadn't voiced to Richard in years, while Caleb, in turn, revealed fragments of his childhood fears, the loneliness he had carried, the deep-seated longing for connection he had buried under layers of caution. When their hands accidentally brushed over the same book, Eleanor felt a jolt that made her stomach twist. She pulled back slightly, reminding herself of her boundaries. Caleb noticed, his eyes softening with understanding, but he didn't comment. The restraint between them only made the tension heavier, a silent acknowledgement of the attraction growing too strong to ignore. By the time Caleb left, Eleanor was acutely aware of the hours she had spent anticipating his presence, savoring their closeness, and feeling the rush of emotions she had denied herself for decades. At home, Richard noticed her distraction again. "You've been quiet," he said that night, a little sharper than usual. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing," she murmured, her voice hollow even to herself. Lying in bed, Eleanor's mind raced. She knew she was crossing a line in her thoughts, if not yet in action. The emotional intimacy she shared with Caleb had become a force, impossible to ignore, impossible to fully control. And she realized with a mixture of thrill and fear that the next step, whatever that might be, could not be undone. The tension between desire and guilt never felt more alive.
The library was nearly silent, the late afternoon sun slanting through tall windows and casting long, golden lines across the floor. Eleanor had arrived early that day, her coat damp from a light drizzle, her heart already racing with anticipation. She had no practical reason to be there before Caleb, but she couldn't stop herself. Every fiber of her being wanted to see him, to hear him, to exist in the space where they could speak freely. When Caleb entered, she felt the familiar jolt, that mixture of excitement and fear that had grown stronger with each encounter. He smiled, not boldly, but softly, in a way that made her stomach twist with longing. "Hey," he said, voice low and careful. "Got a few minutes?" "Of course," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. They moved to the archive room, the air between them thickening in ways neither could articulate. As they worked through a stack of letters and journals, their hands occasionally brushed over the same page. Each touch was fleeting, yet the energy it sparked was undeniable. Eleanor pulled back slightly, aware of the tension and yet unwilling to break eye contact. Caleb's gaze held hers, patient and intense, as though he was testing the boundaries of what was permissible without saying it aloud. Eleanor felt a shiver run through her, the pull of desire mingling with guilt. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but another stronger force urged her closer. "You notice so much," Caleb said softly, almost a whisper. "Most people just skim over things. You see." "I suppose I've had practice," she said, her words carrying an unspoken double meaning. The room seemed to shrink around them. Eleanor was acutely aware of the proximity of his shoulder to hers, the warmth of his presence, the faint scent of his jacket. She could feel her pulse racing, her thoughts scattered between logic and longing. When a stack of letters fell to the floor, their hands reached for it simultaneously. Their fingers touched, lingering a fraction longer than necessary. Eleanor felt her breath catch, her body alert in ways she hadn't in years. It was innocent enough, yet charged with an intimacy that neither had yet named. As they stood, Caleb's voice lowered further. "Eleanor, thank you for being here, for listening, for understanding." Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to respond, wanted to step closer, to let her feelings be seen without restraint, but she held herself back, aware of the fragile line they were walking. When Caleb finally left, the silence of the library pressed down on her. She walked home through the wet streets, each puddle reflecting her own conflicted reflection. At home, Richard was in his usual chair, the same predictable routine, the same distant politeness. Eleanor felt the stark contrast more painfully than ever. That night, lying beside Richard, she was aware of every beat of her own heart, every memory of Caleb's gaze, the electric tension of their closeness. Desire and guilt wrestled inside her. She knew that they were on the precipice of something that could no longer be undone. Eleanor realized, with a shiver of fear and exhilaration, that the line between emotional intimacy and physical desire had almost vanished. The temptation was no longer hypothetical. It was here, undeniable, and waiting for her next choice.
The tension had built for weeks, unnoticed by anyone but Eleanor. At home, Richard's subtle suspicion grew, though he still said nothing directly accusatory. At the library, Caleb's presence had become electric. Every glance, every brush of a hand, every shared silence carried the weight of desire and unspoken longing. Eleanor knew she could no longer pretend she was in control of her emotions. It began that Friday afternoon. Eleanor had stayed late at the library, ostensibly finishing administrative tasks. The rain tapped lightly against the windows, the dim light giving the archive room a hushed intimacy. Caleb arrived, coat damp, and for a moment they both froze in the doorway, aware of the charged atmosphere. "Eleanor," he said softly, I didn't want to push things, but I can't ignore how much we've connected." Her chest tightened. She wanted to respond, wanted to admit everything she had felt in the past weeks, the longing, the excitement, the forbidden thrill of being seen. But the words caught in her throat. "I know," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel it too." The air seemed to thrum around them. Neither moved closer, yet the space between them vibrated with unspoken tension. Eleanor realized, suddenly and painfully, that she was standing at the edge of a choice. The life she had promised herself with Richard, safe and familiar, or the dangerous, intoxicating possibility of something new with Caleb. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Eleanor could feel every heartbeat, every breath, every suppressed desire. The moment was fragile, electric, and terrifying. "I can't do this," she said suddenly, stepping back. Her hands shook. "Not like this, not without consequences." Caleb's face fell, a shadow passing across his features. "I understand," he said quietly, though his voice betrayed the disappointment he could not hide. "I just needed you to know that this, whatever it is, we can't pretend it doesn't exist." Eleanor nodded, tears pricking her eyes. She felt the weight of the truth. Desire could not be unfelt, nor could it be easily dismissed. She was caught between duty and longing, love and temptation, reality and the possibility of something forbidden. By the time she left the library that night, the rain had stopped. The streets were slick with reflections of streetlights, and Eleanor walked slowly, aware that her life was irreversibly changed. She had not crossed the ultimate line physically, but emotionally the boundaries had been shattered. At home, Richard waited, oblivious to the turmoil consuming her. Eleanor forced a smile, forced conversation, forced normalcy. But inside, she knew the truth. The choice had already been made, not in action, but in heart. And the consequences, she realized, with a mix of fear and exhilaration, would follow soon enough. The stage was set. The final chapter of their story loomed, inevitable and tragic, and Eleanor understood that whatever happened next could not be undone.
The library was empty that evening, the final rays of the sun casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Eleanor had arrived early, not to work, but to think, to feel, to face the truth she had been running from for weeks. Caleb would arrive soon, and she knew whatever happened next would change everything. When he entered, the familiar jolt of desire surged through her. He smiled softly, a mixture of warmth and longing. But today there was a gravity in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a recognition that they had reached the point where words and restraint could no longer hold back what was between them. "Eleanor," Caleb said quietly, stepping closer, "I can't pretend anymore. I can't ignore what this is." She swallowed hard. Her mind raced with the weight of her marriage, the life she had promised herself with Richard, and the undeniable pull toward Caleb. Every instinct screamed to reach for him, to surrender to the longing that had grown impossible to deny. But Eleanor also saw the cost. She saw Richard's quiet life waiting at home, unaware yet vulnerable. She saw the consequences of giving in to desire, of allowing passion to overwrite loyalty. And she understood something fundamental. Even if she took Caleb's hand, even if they allowed themselves a single stolen moment, the aftermath would haunt them forever. "I can't," she whispered, tears spilling despite her efforts to remain composed. "Not like this. Not ever." Caleb's expression fell, the hope in his eyes dimming, replaced by a profound sadness. "I understand," he said, his voice barely audible. "I always knew there was a line. I just hoped—" "You hoped," Eleanor interrupted softly, "that love could fix what life has broken. But some things aren't meant to be." They stood together for a long moment, the silence, heavy, intimate, tragic. Then Caleb stepped back, nodded, and left, leaving Eleanor alone in the dim light of the library. She felt both relief and a deep ache, the paradox of having felt alive in his presence and yet knowing it could never continue. That night she returned home to Richard, to the life she had chosen, but the world felt forever altered. She carried Caleb with her, not in action, not in touch, but in memory and in the quiet corners of her heart. The yearning, the intimacy, the emotional awakening, all of it left a permanent mark she could never erase. Eleanor realized, finally, that some loves are not meant to be lived fully. They are meant to transform, to leave traces, to teach what it feels like to be truly seen. And in that realization, there was both sorrow and a strange, haunting beauty. The story of Eleanor and Caleb ended without a single moment of physical betrayal, yet it left a wound, a memory, a bittersweet imprint of what could have been. Desire, longing, and forbidden connection remained, quietly shaping the rest of her life, forever unspoken but never forgotten.